Alright, so I wasn't planning on writing this down, but after telling my girlfriend about it for the 100th time last night, she convinced me to post it here. It's a story about my brother, Jake, and me, and how one random weekend turned into a memory we'll never forget. To set the stage, I'm Adam, 28, the responsible older brother. Jake is 26, the wild card of the family. We grew up in rural Pennsylvania, in this creaky old farmhouse our dad inherited from his grandfather. Picture peeling white paint, a sagging porch, and woods for miles. The kind of place that was charming to visit but a nightmare to live in as a teenager. Our dad passed away a few years back. Heart attack, quick, brutal, and completely unexpected. It hit Jake harder than it hit me, I think. He and Dad were closer in that weird way where they could sit in silence and just get each other. Me? I was more of a mama's boy, always looking for a way to get out of chores or dodge his lectures. Anyway, after Dad passed, Jake and I weren't on the best of terms. It wasn't a blowout fight or anything, just distance. Life happened. I moved to Pittsburgh for work. Jake stayed local, fixing cars and fishing every chance he got. We'd call on holidays or birthdays, but that was about it. Until last spring. Jake called me out of the blue one Friday night. I remember it clearly because I was halfway through a beer, ready to settle in for some Netflix, when my phone buzzed. "Hey Adam," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "You got plans this weekend?" I didn't. "Why? What's up? Can you come home? To the house?" Something in his tone made me pause. It wasn't like Jake to ask for favors. "Yeah, sure. Everything okay? I just found something. Something of Dad's. I think you should see it." That's all he said before hanging up. The next morning, I was on the road. It was about a 3-hour drive, the kind where the landscape shifts from strip malls and gas stations to nothing but trees and the occasional deer carcass. By the time I pulled up to the farmhouse, Jake was already outside, leaning against his old Chevy, smoking a cigarette. He waved me over with this half-smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Glad you made it," he said, crushing the butt under his boot. "Yeah, well, you sounded serious." I gestured toward the house. "What's going on?" Instead of answering, he pulled something out of his pocket and handed it to me. It was a watch, Dad's watch. Brass, with a cracked leather strap and an inscription on the back. "To William, time is precious. Love, Emily." Mom gave it to Dad on their wedding day. He wore it every single day until he died, and then it was gone. We searched for it, tore the house apart, but it just vanished. Mom was devastated. "Where did you find this?" I asked, turning it over in my hands like it might dissolve. Jake jerked his thumb toward the woods. "Buried. Near the creek." "What the hell?" I blinked. "How did it get there?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out," Jake said, lighting another cigarette. "I thought maybe you'd remember something." We spent the next few hours retracing Jake's steps. He said he'd been clearing out the old shed near the creek when he stumbled on a loose patch of dirt. It didn't look like much, just a dip in the ground. But when he started digging, he found the watch wrapped in a rag, buried about 2 feet down. The weird part? The rag wasn't something from our house. It was this heavy burlap material like a sack you'd see in old movies. Definitely not something Dad would have used. "Do you think he buried it?" I asked as we stood by the creek, the water trickling quietly behind us. Jake shook his head. "Why would he? He loved that thing." "Maybe it wasn't him," I said slowly, the thought making my skin crawl. "What if someone else put it there?" Jake didn't answer right away. He just stared at the creek, his jaw tight. Then he said, "There's more." "What do you mean, more?" He didn't respond, just started walking back toward the house. I followed, confused and a little uneasy. Jake wasn't the type to mess with me, but the whole thing felt off, like we'd stumbled into someone else's story. When we got back to the house, Jake led me upstairs to Dad's old study. It hadn't changed much since he passed. Bookshelves lined with dusty novels, his favorite armchair in the corner, and the heavy oak desk where he used to do the bills. Jake pulled open the bottom drawer and took out a small, locked box. "I found this with the watch," he said, setting it on the desk. It was buried, too. The box was old, metal and covered in rust. It looked like something you'd find in a thrift shop, except for the initials etched on the top. WH Dad's initials. Jake handed me a screwdriver. "You want to do the honors?" I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. After a few minutes of prying, the lock popped open, and the lid creaked as I lifted it. Inside were papers, yellowed, brittle, and covered in Dad's handwriting. Most of it was letters, addressed to someone named John. "Who's John?" I asked, flipping through the pages. Jake shrugged. "Beats me. Keep reading." The letters were strange. They talked about debts, promises, and something Dad referred to as the deal. There were dates, some from before Jake and I were born, and cryptic references to keeping the family safe. One line stood out, scrawled in shaky handwriting. "If they come back, bury the watch. It's the only way." I looked up at Jake, my heart pounding. "What the hell does that mean?" "I was hoping you'd know," Jake said, his voice low. "But Adam, I don't think this was just Dad's watch. I think it's something else." The rest of the weekend was a blur. We read every letter, trying to piece together what Dad had been involved in. The more we read, the less it made sense. Debts to who? Promises about what? And why was the watch so important? By Sunday night, we were no closer to an answer. Jake wanted to keep digging, literally, but I convinced him to wait. Something about the whole thing felt dangerous, like we were messing with something we didn't understand. I took the letters back to Pittsburgh, hoping a fresh set of eyes might help. But weeks turned into months, and I got nowhere. The watch is still in my desk drawer, ticking away like nothing happened. Jake calls me more often now. We're closer than we've been in years, which is a silver lining, I guess. But every time we talk, there's this unspoken question hanging between us. What did Dad do? And why does it still feel like we're waiting for the other shoe to drop? If you've made it this far, thanks for reading. I don't know if this story has a proper ending yet, but if anything else happens, I'll update. For now, all I can say is this. Some secrets don't stay buried, no matter how deep you dig. Alright, so a few months passed after Jake and I found the watch in Dad's letters. Life started to settle back into normal, or as normal as it could after something like that. Jake would call every so often to check in, but every time, I could hear it in his voice. He was still thinking about the watch, the letters, and whatever the hell the deal was. And honestly, so was I. But then something happened that pulled us right back in. It was late September when Jake called me again, this time at 3 a.m. I remember fumbling for my phone, groggy and annoyed, until I saw his name on the screen. My stomach sank. Jake wasn't the kind of guy to call in the middle of the night unless it was serious. "Jake? What's going on?" I croaked. "Adam," he said, his voice frantic, almost panicked. "You need to come back. Now." "What? Why? Are you okay?" "It's not me," he said, barely catching his breath. "It's the house. Someone broke in." By the time I got there, the sun was just starting to rise. Jake was sitting on the porch, his shotgun leaning against the railing. His hands were shaking, a cigarette dangling from his lips. "Who was it?" I asked, stepping out of my car. He shook his head. "I don't know. I didn't see their face. But Adam, they weren't just robbing the place. They were looking for something." My stomach twisted. "Looking for what?" Jake pointed toward the house. "Come inside. I'll show you." The living room was a mess. Cushions ripped open, drawers dumped out, picture frames shattered. Whoever it was, they'd been thorough. But what really got me was Dad's study. The desk had been torn apart, papers scattered everywhere, the drawer where we'd found the box broken off its hinges. "They were in here for a while," Jake said, his voice grim. "But the weirdest part? They didn't take anything. Just left everything like this. It didn't make sense. If this was just some random break-in, why not grab the TV? Or the antique clock in the hallway? Why tear through the study like they were on a mission?" Then I noticed something. "Where's the box?" I asked, looking around. Jake's eyes darkened. "It's gone." We spent the next few hours cleaning up, but the whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Jake must have felt it too because he kept glancing out the window, his jaw tight. Finally, I asked the question that had been gnawing at me. Do you think this has something to do with Dad? With the letters? Jake didn't answer right away. He just lit another cigarette, staring at the woods like they might hold some kind of answer. I think whoever broke in, they knew about the box, he said eventually. And if they knew about the box, they probably knew about the watch. I reached into my pocket, feeling the familiar weight of Dad's watch. I started carrying it with me everywhere, partly out of habit and partly because, well, I didn't trust leaving it behind. What do we do? I asked. Jake looked at me, his expression hard. We figure out what Dad was hiding. For real this time. Over the next few weeks, we went full detective mode. Jake started talking to some of the older folks in town, trying to see if anyone knew more about Dad's past. Meanwhile, I dug into the letters again, trying to piece together the timeline. Most of the letters were addressed to John, but there were a few others. One to someone named Margaret and another to DB. The more I read, the more it felt like Dad had been part of something bigger. There were mentions of meetings at odd hours, payments made in cash, and one line that still gives me chills. If John doesn't deliver, they'll come for the family. Make sure the watch stays hidden. I didn't know what to make of it, but Jake had a theory. What if the watch isn't just a watch? He said one night, as we sat in the study, surrounded by papers. What if it's, I don't know, a key? Or a code? Something they needed. It sounded crazy, but after everything that had happened, I couldn't rule it out. Things escalated about a week later. Jake called me again, this time in the middle of the day. His voice was sharp, urgent. Adam, you need to get here. Now. What is it? I asked, already grabbing my keys. It's the watch, he said. Something's happening. When I got to the house, Jake was in the kitchen, the watch sitting on the table in front of him. It was glowing. Not brightly, but enough to make the brass casing shimmer in the dim light. What the hell is that? I asked, staring at it. Jake shook his head. It started about an hour ago. I don't know why, but I think it's trying to tell us something. I wanted to laugh, to tell him he was losing it, but I couldn't deny what I was seeing. The watch was glowing, faint but steady, like it was alive. Jake reached for it, his fingers trembling. I think we need to go back to the creek. We grabbed flashlights and headed into the woods. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Jake led the way, the watch clutched tightly in his hand. When we got to the creek, the glow started to pulse, faster and brighter. Jake knelt down, holding the watch over the spot where he'd found it. I think we need to dig, he said. We didn't have shovels, so we used our hands, clawing at the dirt like animals. It didn't take long before we hit something solid. A metal box, larger than the first, its surface etched with strange symbols. Jake and I looked at each other, breathless. Do we open it? I asked. Jake nodded, his face pale. We have to. Inside was a notebook, its pages filled with the same symbols as the box. But there was one page written in English in Dad's handwriting. It said, "If you found this, it means they're already watching. The watch is the key. Protect it at all costs. And Adam, Jake, I'm sorry." We stared at the note, the weight of his words sinking in. Before we could say anything, though, we heard it. A branch snapping behind us. We turned, flashlights cutting through the darkness. But there was nothing there. Just the woods, silent and still. But we both knew, deep down, that we weren't alone anymore. And this was just the beginning. I wish I could say that night ended there. That we went back to the house, locked the doors, and figured everything out over a pot of coffee. But that's not what happened. What happened next still gives me chills every time I think about it. The sound of the snapping branch echoed through the woods, too loud, too deliberate to be just an animal. Jake and I froze, the open metal box still between us. I could feel my pulse hammering in my throat, my fingers gripping the flashlight so tight it hurt. "Who's there?" Jake called out, his voice steady but sharp. He grabbed the shotgun slung over his shoulder, cocking it with a metallic click. No answer. Just the wind shifting through the trees, carrying with it the faintest sound of footsteps. I shone my flashlight toward the direction of the noise, my hand trembling. "Jake, we need to go. Now." But Jake didn't move. His eyes were locked on something in the distance. "Do you see that?" he whispered. First, I didn't, but then my light caught it. A figure, standing just beyond the tree line. Not moving, not making a sound. It was too dark to make out any details, but I could tell it wasn't just someone out for a nighttime stroll. They were watching us. Jake raised the shotgun, his knuckles white. "I'm giving you one chance. Show yourself." Still nothing. The figure just stood there, the shadows clinging to them like a second skin. And then, as if they'd heard some signal we couldn't, they turned and walked away. Slowly, deliberately, disappearing into the darkness. We didn't wait to see if they'd come back. Jake slammed the box shut, stuffed it under his arm, and we ran. Flat out back to the house. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure chasing us, but the woods were empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. When we burst through the front door, Jake locked it behind us, double-checking every window and door while I tried to catch my breath. The box sat on the kitchen table, its strange symbols catching the flicker of the overhead light. "What the hell was that?" I asked, pacing back and forth. "Who was that?" Jake didn't answer right away. He was staring at the box, his face pale, his hands gripping the edges of the table. Finally, he said, "I think it's starting." "What's starting?" Jake looked up at me, his eyes filled with something I hadn't seen before, fear. Whatever Dad was trying to protect us from. We spent the rest of the night trying to decipher the notebook. Most of it was written in those strange symbols, but there were a few more pages in English. One of them stood out. "They are drawn to the watch. If it leaves the family, it becomes unstable. Do not let it fall into their hands. The consequences will be irreversible." The word irreversible was underlined 3 times, and there was a smudge of ink beneath it, like Dad's hand had been shaking when he wrote it. "What does that even mean?" I asked, rubbing my temples. "Unstable? Consequences? This doesn't make any sense." Jake was silent for a moment, flipping through the pages. Then he said, "I think the watch is some kind of beacon, or a signal. Dad must have been hiding it to keep it out of sight." I stared at him. "You're saying the watch is like, what, a homing device? For them?" Jake shrugged, but his expression was grim. "I don't know. But if they wanted it bad enough to break into the house and bury the first box, then yeah, maybe." The next few days were a blur of paranoia and piecing together whatever scraps of information we could. Jake and I barely slept, taking shifts to keep watch over the house. Every so often, we'd hear strange noises outside. A low hum, like static, or the faint crunch of leaves underfoot. But every time we checked, there was nothing there. The only lead we had was the name John, which appeared over and over in Dad's letters. Jake suggested we visit some of Dad's old friends in town, see if anyone knew a John who might have been close to him. That's how we ended up in front of old Mr. Carpenter's house, a retired history teacher who'd been Dad's best friend back in the day. He was in his 70s now, frail but sharp as ever. When we showed him the watch and mentioned John, his face darkened. "You boys need to let this go," he said, his voice trembling. "Your father spent his whole life trying to keep you safe. Don't undo his work." "What do you mean?" Jake pressed. "Safe from what?" Mr. Carpenter hesitated, glancing toward the window like he was afraid someone might be listening. Then he leaned in, lowering his voice. "There are things in this world you don't mess with. Your father made a deal, one he regretted till the day he died. That watch is tied to it, to them. And if they're sniffing around again, it means the deal's broken." "Who are they?" I asked, my throat dry. Mr. Carpenter shook his head. "It's better if you don't know. Just get rid of the watch. Bury it, burn it, whatever you have to do. But don't let it stay in this house." That night, Jake and I argued for hours. He wanted to keep the watch, figure out what it all meant, maybe even use it as leverage. I wanted to get rid of it, to follow Mr. Carpenter's advice and bury the damn thing where no one could ever find it. In the end, we compromised. We'd keep it for a little while longer, just long enough to figure out what Dad had gotten himself into. But deep down, I think we both knew that holding on to it was a mistake. because later that night, as I lay awake in the guest room, I heard it again. That hum, low and insistent, like static buzzing in my ears. I sat up, my heart racing, and that's when I saw it. A shadow moving across the hallway, too tall, too thin, its movements unnaturally smooth. I froze, barely breathing, as the shadow stopped just outside my door. Then, slowly, it turned its head, though it had no face, to look at me. And then it whispered, in a voice like crackling radio static, "The watch belongs to us." The moment those words, "the watch belongs to us," hit my ears, it felt like the air was sucked out of the room. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I just sat there, staring at the door, at that impossible shadow standing there, watching me with nothing. No face, no eyes, just an overwhelming presence that pinned me to the bed. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the shadow flickered. It didn't walk away. It didn't vanish like smoke. It just blinked out of existence like an old TV turned off. I sat there for what felt like hours, the hum still buzzing faintly in my ears, before I finally worked up the nerve to move. My legs were shaking as I swung them off the bed and crept into the hallway. It was empty, but the house felt wrong. Too quiet, like it was holding its breath. I found Jake in the kitchen, sitting at the table with the watch in front of him, his shotgun resting on the counter. His eyes snapped to me the moment I walked in, and I didn't have to say anything for him to know. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded. It spoke to me. Jake cursed under his breath, running a hand through his hair. "They're getting closer. Jake, we need to get rid of it. Now. Tonight." He didn't argue. For the first time since this whole thing started, he actually looked scared, like he finally understood we were in over our heads. We decided to bury the watch where we'd found the first box, by the creek. It was the only place that felt right, like maybe the land itself would know what to do with it. We packed up the watch and the notebook, wrapped them in the burlap sack we'd found with the first box, and set out into the woods. It was dark, but we didn't dare use flashlights. Something about the light felt wrong, like it would draw attention. So we stumbled through the trees in near total darkness, guided only by the faint glow of the watch, still pulsing faintly through the burlap. By the time we reached the creek, the hum had returned, louder now, vibrating through my bones, making it hard to think. Jake was shaking as he dug the hole, muttering curses under his breath. "Hurry up," I hissed, glancing over my shoulder. The woods felt alive, like the trees were leaning in closer, their branches stretching toward us. Jake finally dropped the watch into the hole, along with the notebook, and started piling the dirt back on top. As he did, the hum grew louder, almost deafening, until silence. The moment the last handful of dirt hit the ground, the hum stopped. The glow disappeared. The woods fell into a stillness so complete it felt unnatural, like the world had hit pause. Jake and I stood there, staring at the freshly covered hole, neither of us daring to speak. Then, faintly, from somewhere deep in the woods, we heard it. The sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, getting closer. "We need to go," Jake said, his voice shaking. I didn't argue. We turned and ran, crashing through the trees like animals, not caring about the noise or the branches clawing at our clothes. By the time we made it back to the house, we were both out of breath, drenched in sweat, but alive. That night we didn't sleep. We sat in the living room, the shotgun between us, waiting for something to happen. But the house stayed quiet. No shadows, no hum, just the creak of the old floorboards and the wind outside. By morning, it felt like a weight had lifted. The house was just a house again. The woods were just woods. And for the first time in months I felt like maybe, just maybe, we'd put this nightmare behind us. A week later, I packed up and went back to Pittsburgh. Jake stayed behind, determined to keep an eye on the house, just in case. We promised to stay in touch, to call every week, but deep down, I think we both knew we wouldn't talk much about what happened. Some things are better left unsaid. Months passed. Life went on. The watch stayed buried, and the woods stayed quiet. But sometimes, late at night, I'd catch myself staring at the spot on my desk where I used to keep it, wondering if it was really over. Then last week, I got a call from Jake. "Adam," he said, his voice trembling. "I think they're back." He didn't say much, just that he'd heard the hum again, faint but unmistakable. He was planning to leave the house, to come stay with me for a while, but before he hung up, he said something that's been haunting me ever since. "I think burying it wasn't enough," he said. "I think they want us now." So here I am, writing this down because I don't know what else to do. Jake hasn't called again, and when I tried calling him, it went straight to voicemail. I'm planning to drive back to the house tomorrow, but part of me doesn't want to. Part of me is terrified of what I'll find, or worse, what I won't find. If you've read this far, you probably think I'm crazy. And maybe I am. But if something happens to me or to Jake, I need someone to know the truth. Because whatever this is, it isn't over. Not yet. And I don't think it ever will be.